fixed assets will serve the organization for a very long time, whereas the current assets will be serving the organization for a period of less than 1 year. Current assets is usually financed through short-term sources, that is current liabilities. What are the current liabilities? Are these liabilities which have to be paid within a short span of 1 year. Production cycle is the time span between the receipt of the raw materials and the conversion into finished goods. Hello everyone, I am Purnima, faculty in the Department of Commerce, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Temple of Excellence. In this session 5 on financial management, I will be having a discussion on what do we mean by working capital. Or we should also understand what is the need for working capital and what are the various sources through which working capital can be procured. Now, let us understand what do we mean by current asset and then later on what do we mean by working capital. Now, apart from investment in fixed assets, every business organization needs to invest in current assets. The investment facilitates smooth day-to-day operations of the business. Current assets are usually more liquid but contribute less to the profits than fixed assets. Now, we all know that there are two types of assets which are fixed assets and current assets. Now, fixed assets will serve the organization for a very long time, whereas the current assets will be serving the organization for a period of less than 1 year. Or these current assets are always changeable into cash within a period of 1 year. Now, why we call them as more liquid? Because they are easily convertible into cash. Now, for examples of current assets, what are the examples of current assets? It can be cash in hand or at bank. So, they are called as current assets. Then, other than this cash, we have the inventory, or we can also call it as the stock. The stock in hand, or it may be the stock of finished goods, or it may be the stock of raw materials, or it may be the stock of unfinished goods. So, all this comprise the stock of goods. Then, we also have the debtors balance. Now, what do we mean by debtors? So, these debtors are our customers who have just purchased from us but who have to pay us. So, there is some amount of money due from the debtors. So, they will come under current assets, and also the bills receivable. Now, what is this bills receivable? So, these bills receivable have come from the debtors. So, they are drawn on the debtors which say that certain amount of money is due from these debtors. Now, whenever we talk of current assets, so all these will come under current assets. In addition to this, we also have the advance payment of expenses. Whenever the expenses are paid in advance, so it may be the current bill, or it may be the insurance premium, or it may be the tax paid in advance. So, any advance payment of expenditure also will be considered under this current assets. So, we should understand that current assets are those assets which are needed for day-to-day running of the business. And then we should also understand that current assets don't give more profits, but then they are essential for the organization. Next, let us see much more information on what do we mean by these current assets. So, these current assets are expected to get converted into cash or cash equivalents within a period of 1 year. An asset is more liquid if it can be converted into cash quicker without reduction in value. So, whenever we need to have this current assets, so it will be through the working capital. So, this working capital is the oil which just oils the day-to-day operations of the business. Now, whenever these current assets are involved, they will be converted into cash within 1 year, and as such, they can be converted into cash without any reduction in value. Now, we should also understand that current liabilities. So along with current assets, there are certain current liabilities. Now, what are the current liabilities? See, they are those payment obligations which are due for payment within 1 year, such as bills payable, creditors, outstanding expenses, advance receipts from customers, etc. Now, we should understand that along with current assets, we will be having current liabilities also. Now, what are the current liabilities? Are these liabilities which have to be paid within a short span of 1 year. So, they are, first one is the bills payable. So, these bills payable are those bills which are drawn on us from the creditors. So, whenever we purchase goods or whenever we purchase raw materials from our suppliers, so they will become our creditors, and when we take time for repayment, they will draw a bill on us which we call it as the bills payable. Then the creditors. So, other than the suppliers, the organization would have purchased loans from external sources called as the creditors, and also the outstanding expenses are those expenses which the company has to meet in the day-to-day running of the organization. So, it may be the electricity bill, it may be the taxes to be paid, it may be the salary paid to the employees and on office administration, etc. So, all these day-to-day running of the business are those expenses which keep on occurring in the business. So, they are essential for running the business, and as such, the sum of them we can consider as current liabilities. And also, in addition to all this, we have the advances received from customers. Sometimes the customers pay advance money along with their order. So, until the order is executed, this advance money which has been collected from the customers, it will be considered as current liability. Now, next, let us see what this current asset means. Some part of the current asset is usually financed through short-term sources, that is, through current liabilities. The rest is financed through long-term sources, and it is called as the net working capital. So, the net working capital is current assets minus current liabilities. So, net working capital may be defined as the excess of current assets over current liabilities. Now, in this slide, we came to understand that current assets is usually financed through short-term sources, that is current liabilities. So, whenever the firm wants to run its business, so whenever there is day-to-day activities, so this funding for day-to-day activities will be done with the help of current liabilities. Now, the current liabilities involves the various sources. It may be bills payable, it may be the creditors, etc. Now, the rest of the money which is needed for the business, it will be financed through long-term sources. The long-term sources means it may be through the issue of shares, debentures, etc., and also long-term borrowings, and also through retained earnings. With both the sources of funding, we can run an organization. Now, let us look into how the net working capital is calculated. So, the net working capital is current assets minus current liabilities. So, when there is excess of current assets over the current liabilities, the difference amount is called as the net working capital. Now, next, let us see what are the various factors which are influencing the working capital requirement. As usual, the first factor is the nature of the business. A trading organization usually needs a smaller amount of working capital compared to a manufacturing organization. Service industries which usually do not have to maintain inventory require less working capital. Now, what is the nature of the business? So, the working capital requirement will be decided based on what kind of the business the organization is running. So, if it is a manufacturing sector, it will require huge amount of fixed assets. But if it is a trading concern, the amount of fixed assets will be less, as a result of which the working capital requirement also will be less. Then next one is the service industry. Now, what do we mean by service industries? Service industries are those industries which do not give any products to the customers, but they provide the services. For example, the transport services. So, if you are running a transport service, then what is the major requirement? You will have various kinds of vehicles so that you can transport the people from one place to another, and as such there will be not much requirement for fixed assets. So, depending on the type of service we are giving and depending on the type of activity which is going on in the organization, the net working capital will be decided in the organization. Now, the next factor affecting the working capital requirement is the scale of organization. For organizations which operate on a higher scale of operation, the quantum of inventory and debtors required is generally high. So, depending on the scale of operation, the fixed capital requirement will be decided. Then, the next one is the business cycle. So, different phases of business cycle affect the requirement of the working capital of the firm. Now, we all know that the business cycles affect our business. When the business is in a boom period, then there will be a lot of demand for the goods, as a result of which the working capital requirement will be more. But in case of depression, then there will be lesser demand for goods. As a result, there will be lesser demand for the working capital requirement of the organization. So, these business cycles, whether it is the boom period or it is in the depression period, it will decide the amount of working capital needed by the company. So, the business cycles will always have a bearing on the inflation rate of the company also. So, in the boom period, the prices keep on rising, whereas in the depression, there will be a fall in the demand, as a result of which there will be fall in the prices of products. Now, the fourth factor which affects the working capital requirement is the seasonal factors. So, most businesses have some seasonality in their operations. Now, in the peak season, because of higher level of activity, higher amount of working capital is required. Now, what are the seasonal factors? If you can usually see, during the festival season, there will be lot of purchases of consumer durables. So, people want to just purchase the consumer something new for their homes. So, it may be purchase of vehicle, or it may be any consumer durables which are used by the family, etc. So, all this will be usually purchased during the festive season, as a result of which the almost all the companies will be giving festival discounts. They will be also giving us lot of offers so that people buy more and more during that festival season. Now, when the demand becomes more during the festival season, then the company also requires more working capital during that season. So, depending on the season or the peak season or the off season, so the fixed capital work will be decided. The seasonal factors also will refer to those products which are sold during particular seasons. For example, raincoats and umbrellas will be sold more during the rainy season, and also the woolen clothes will be sold more during the winter season, and also books, investment in books, bags, uniform, etc. They will be all the more whenever the school starts or in the beginning of the academic year. So, during the peak season, the company has to gear up to meet all the demands of the customers, as a result of which it will require more fixed working capital. So, depending on the season also, the fixed working capital has to be decided. Then, The next factor affecting the working capital requirement is the production cycle. Now, let us understand what we mean by the word production cycle. So, production cycle is the time span between the receipt of raw material and their conversion into finished goods. So, the duration and length of the production cycle affects the amount of funds required for raw materials and expenses. Consequently, working capital requirement is higher in firms with longer processing cycle and lower in firms with shorter processing cycle. Now, what do we mean by production cycle? So, production cycle is the time span between the receipt of the raw materials and the conversion into finished goods. Now, the company has to invest money for purchase of raw materials. Now, when it purchases the raw materials, it will be always usually in bulk it will be purchasing. So, when it purchases the raw materials in bulk and then the whole process takes up to 3 to 4 months to get converted into finished products, then the company has to wait for 4 months to see that the material gets converted into finished product and then it is sold in the market. So, there will be almost a gap of 6 months between the receipt of the materials and putting the materials in the market. So, for this period of 6 months, the company has to just lock all its resources in the raw materials. So, what is the amount of raw materials it has purchased? So, it has to wait for 6 months to get it converted into a product and thereby sold in the open market. So, this period of 6 to 8 months, when the product gets converted into a finished good, we call it as the production cycle. The duration and length of the production cycle affects the amount of funds required for raw materials and expenses. Now, what is the amount you will be investing in purchase of raw materials, and also for all the 6 months you will be paying all the labor charges etc. and the salaries etc. And then once the raw material gets converted into finished product, then it has to be sold in the market. Only then the company can recover its investment. So, this will be a very large period and it will decide the fixed working capital requirement of the company. Consequently, working capital requirement is higher in firms with longer processing cycle. So, if you have a very lengthy processing cycle, then you may need more fixed capital compared to companies with shorter processing cycle. So, companies with shorter processing cycle, so suppose the raw material is introduced today and within 1 month it gets converted into a finished product, then your funds will not be locked for a very long period. So, within 1 month you can always get it easily converted into cash, and as such the fixed capital requirement will be lesser for those companies. Then the next factor which affects the fixed working capital requirement is the credit allowed. Now, what do we mean by credit allowed? Different firms allow different credit terms to their customers. These depend upon the level of competition a firm faces as well as the credit worthiness of their clientele. A liberal credit policy results in higher amount of debtors, increasing the requirement of working capital. Now, what is the credit allowed by the organization for its customers? Now, what is the period within which the customers have to repay the money? So, this factor will affect the working capital requirement. Now, this will depend upon the level of competition that firm faces. Suppose that firm is doing very well and there is lot of competition, then we may have to allow a longer period of credit for our customers, and as well as the credit worthiness of the clientele. That is, if the customers are of a very high credit worthiness, then we can always offer them a higher credit period. But if they are not so very credit worthy, then we should see that they pay back the loans taken on time. A liberal credit policy results in higher amount of debtors. Suppose the company is very liberal in giving advances to its customers, then we may need lot of money for financing our customers, and as a result of which we may have to go in for higher working capital. So, suppose you are giving a period of 3 months as credit for our debtors, then our funds will be locked with them for the next 3 months, and we have to wait till they repay our money. So this period of 3 months, the company has to survive, and it has to survive on the working capital, and as a result of which the working capital requirement will be higher here. So the next factor affecting the working capital requirement is the credit allowed. Just as a firm allows credit to its customers, it also may get credit from its suppliers. To the extent it avails the credit on purchases, the working capital requirement is reduced. Now, just like the firm is giving advances to its debtors, it may expect to get the same sort of credit facility from its suppliers. Now, if the suppliers have a very liberal credit policy, they are giving us a lot of time to repay the money for the raw materials we have purchased, then the fixed capital requirement will be lower because we have lot of time to repay to our suppliers. Then the next factor affecting the working capital requirement is operating efficiency. Now, what do we mean by operating efficiency? When the firm is able to manage its raw materials. So, if it can manage with a very small amount of raw materials, then we can say that the firm is doing very well. How we can say the firm is doing very well? By the calculation of inventory turnover ratio. If the inventory turnover ratio is very high, we know that the firm is working very, very efficiently. So, through all these measures, if we can achieve operational efficiency in the organization, the working capital requirement will be lesser. Then, the next factor affecting the working capital requirement is availability of raw materials. If the raw materials and other required materials are available freely and continuously, lower stock may suffice. Larger the lead time, larger the quantity of material to be stored, larger shall be the working capital requirement. Now, we should also understand what is the type of raw material which is being used by the company. So, if the raw material is freely available in the market, then the company need not bother to stock it up in the godown. So, it may, as and when the raw material gets over, it can order for the fresh supplies and see that the production goes on continuously in the organization. But then, if the raw material is very scarce and it has to be imported from a foreign country or something like that, then we have to purchase in bulk. Then it has to be stored and then it has to be utilized. So, if there is such a situation where the raw material has to be purchased in bulk and it is not easily available in the market, then we have to just lock all our resources in the purchase of raw materials. So, when we are investing more amount of money in our raw materials, then the working capital requirement will be higher. Then, the next factor affecting the working capital requirement is growth prospect. So, if the growth potential of a concern is perceived to be higher, it will require larger amount of working capital. So, it will be able to meet higher production and sales target whenever required. So, working capital requirement will depend on the plans of the organization. So, if the organization has a very large scale growth plans, then what will happen is it will require large amount of working capital. So, why it requires larger amount of working capital? Because it calls for higher production. So, when they have a very high sales target is to be achieved, so they have a sales target of 1 lakh units to be sold in a particular year, then we have to ensure that the production also has to be 1 lakh units. So, if the production has to be 1 lakh units, then the company has to see that there should be raw materials to produce 1 lakh units, and also the necessary assembly and the factory line to produce that number of units. Hence, it is essential for the company to see that in order to achieve the sales target, all these things are met, and all these things require huge amount of fixed capital as well as working capital, and hence it will have a bearing on the amount of working capital to be needed by the company. Then the other factors affecting working capital requirement are the level of competition. Now, what do we mean by level of competition? Higher level of competitiveness means necessitates larger stocks of finished goods to meet urgent orders from customers. Now, if the company is producing products which are highly competitive or which has lot of competition in the market, then it has to ensure that there is a stock of finished goods always available to meet the ever increasing demand for the product. Now, when you have all your funds locked up in the finished goods, then that will require lot of working capital. So, depending on the competition the company is facing or the product is facing, then we will have to see that a working capital will be met. Then, the last factor affecting the working capital required is the inflation. With rising prices, larger amounts are required even to maintain a constant volume of production and sales. The working capital requirement of a business becomes higher with higher rate of inflation. Now, we should understand what is the meaning of the word inflation. The inflation is nothing but the rise in prices of goods. Now, whenever there is a rise in price of goods, it will affect all the aspects of the business federation. So, whenever there is a rise in prices, it may affect the prices of our raw materials also. So, when the raw materials are to be purchased, it will always be at a higher price, and then it will also have a bearing on the products which are being sold in the market. So, whenever you are paying more for the raw material, then the products will have to be sold at a higher price in the market also. So, whenever this inflationary trend will affect all the sectors of the organization, but then whenever it affects the raw material, it will have a bearing on the product cost also. As a result of which, if it affects the price of raw materials, then we have to see that the working capital also gets increased proportionately to meet the higher purchasing cost of raw materials. Then the actual requirement shall depend upon the rates of price change of different components. Example, raw material, finished goods, labor cost, etc. Finished goods as well as their proportion in the total requirement. So, the total requirement of the working capital will depend on all these things, that is the price of raw materials, the price of finished goods, and also the labor cost involved. So, all these together, they affect the working capital of the company. I hope you have understood this session on the working capital, which is the last part in this chapter on financial management. Thank you.